This is the Devil's Guide to D&D. Devil's Delegate here, and I want to talk about roles in D&D 5e. What they are, why do they matter, and how to use them to make an effective party, and a more enjoyable one to play. After all, D&D is a role-playing game, so roles count. Optimizers often dwell on one area of play and forget the rest of the game, and the party. In D&D, there is no optimized character. There's an optimized party, and that's all about roles. Roles have been with D&D from the beginning, and it's the roles and a few odd-shaped dice that make D&D a game instead of an improv session, and most people really aren't good at improv. Before getting to the current roles, I need to cover roles in general in 5e because it's become a divisive topic. This comes to a great extent from the misconception that roles reduce and hamper roleplay in the game, which is actually an evolution of arguments that took place decades ago when some players objected to the addition of skills to the game. Really, not having roles, like not having skills, limits the game. It's very difficult generally to introduce scenes and activities if there's absolutely no concrete way of dealing with them. The rest of the negative feelings toward roles came from Wizards of the Coast itself, and is a marketing ploy. See, they leaned heavily into roles for 4e. Like, really heavily. Not that this made roles more important in 4e. Roles have always been crucial. But that they were talked about much more, and everything was laid out around them. And as 4e is considered a failure, they wanted to distance 5e as much as possible from it by pretending that this foundation of the game didn't exist. As I said, roles have always been a part of D&D, making it the massive hit that it's become, and that structure has been copied hundreds if not thousands of times. So for those of you who dislike the whole concept of roles, let me lay out the benefits. And for those of you already on board, skip ahead to whatever this timestamp is, where I'll get into current roles. When I started playing in the mid to late 1970s, the roles matched the classes. There were 4 roles and 4 classes: fighter, cleric, magic user, and thief. And the perfect party was made up of 4 characters. And things got problematic with added players because not all roles worked as well with multiple players taking them on. I'll get to that. I find it easier to talk about the roles in general in that environment rather than the current, more complicated one, which I'll also get to. Structurally, having set roles makes it much easier for designers and for DMs. Roles define activity. Picking locks and disarming traps are only an aspect of the game because the thief was a role. He could disarm traps, so there's traps. If there had been no thief role, there would have been some traps, but only ones that could be solved with a puzzle or avoided. Determining if a car was used in a crime is not part of the game, as there's no auto mechanic role. However, there was a thief role, so any DM could safely lay out a dungeon with a bunch of locked doors and traps, and any party then needs to make sure that that role is covered. But the roles are much more important than just structure. Roles allow players to have some guide on what they're doing. I've played in games without roles, and there's a whole lot of time early on where people don't do anything. A player wouldn't know what's expected, what's allowed, what's possible, and with infinite options, will choose none. However, with roles, a stranger can join a game and know immediately what to do. A brand new player takes on the role of the cleric. Okay. He knows to stand in front of the weaker magic user and thief. He knows to buff party members, and he knows to heal them. He might not know how to do any of these things very well, but he can manage something, and he can do that from moment 1. My first game I was brought to by a friend into a room with people I didn't know, and a game that had been going on for months. And after rolling some d6s, I had a fighter. I didn't know the game, but I knew that my fighter should fight. But the real genius of the Roles Foundation is that it makes everyone work together, cooperate, and with that gives everyone a moment to shine. In games like this, it is really easy for one person to take over, to dominate everything as everyone else sits around twiddling their thumbs. It's also easy, unfortunately, for players to start bickering and backstabbing one another. But the whole notion of roles goes against that. No one person can succeed. All the roles need to be covered or you can't win, and no single person can take on all the roles. The magic user is no good without the fighter standing in front of him, and the cleric healing him, and the rogue opening the door. So players work together. And no matter how dominant one player is, the shy, quiet player gets his moment, because he's absolutely necessary. While this is important in any D&D game, it makes pickup games, league play, and joining strangers even possible. The closer the friendship between players, the less vital this becomes, but it's always important. When I started my first college game with a couple people from my classes and a few from the dorm, having set roles was essential. You may notice a problem there, which is everyone is necessary if they are unique. If you have a 4-person party made up of a fighter, cleric, magic user, and rogue, everyone has their moment. But if you have a 5th person, another magic user, well, now one or the other of them is likely to not get those cool moments. We all realized this pretty quick back in the day, and so larger parties tended to have multiple fighters as they didn't get in each other's way as much, and multiple clerics, as players tended to be happy to share healing duties, but often only one magic user and one rogue. So we had 4 roles wrapped in 4 classes. I'll ignore the other early classes, which tended to take on either the exact same roles as one of the 4 base classes, or be a strange chimera. Someday I'll talk about the AD&D bards. How did the roles change? Well, 2 major things happened. Firstly, some of the initial roles weren't satisfying. Clerics were often heal bots, and players complained they weren't having fun. And the rogue was inferior to other choices except in a few areas, those locks and traps. So, you break up the roles into smaller roles that then can be put together in different configurations. You could take the buffing of the cleric, but now combine it with the damage dealing of the fighter. The other thing was that most of those original games took place in the dungeon, and so we got new roles as we came more and more out of the dungeon, along with skills so that some roles wouldn't be dependent on any class. While 2nd and more 3rd editions made the classes to be a combination of roles, thus making classes often overlap, 4th edition at least acted like it was again just 4 roles, but that different classes could fulfill them, those being the striker, defender, leader, and controller. So multiple classes could play the exact same role, with the difference being the power source: martial, divine, arcane, primal, or psionic. 5th edition can be thought of as an evolution of 3rd edition more than 4th, with each class taking on multiple roles. And more roles give us new and different sorts of challenges to put those roles to the test. So what you want to have for an effective party, and also one that's the most fun for the players, is for the characters to cover all the roles, while minimizing overlap, and in some cases, completely avoiding overlap, so that the party is ready for every challenge and that everyone gets their moments to shine. This also means that you want characters to be good at their roles, but it's fine, and sometimes even preferable, to be terrible at other roles. 5e is not a game where being mediocre at anything is useful or enjoyable. You want to succeed in your role. Anything else you leave to someone else. An important element of 5e is that the roles are not tied to classes. It is possible to build a character with most any class to play most roles. Mostly. A monoclassed wizard healer is a bridge too far, and a bard tank really isn't very tanky. Some classes fit roles better, and for some it's much harder, and you find that you limit your other options, but it is mostly possible. At least if the optional feat rules are being used. And aren't they always? Does anyone play without feats? This makes it more important than in past editions to build your characters together with other players, because just being told that someone is playing a cleric doesn't mean that the traditional cleric roles will be covered. Alright, so finally, let's get to it. What are the character roles in 5e? I list 10, 5 in combat and 5 out of combat, though one of the combat roles is also an out of combat role. I've seen people list fewer roles, which mostly means they are combining two of the ones I've defined, which doesn't describe the distribution of roles as well. I've also seen 4 additional roles that I'm not using: Debuffer, Blaster, Brute, and Survivalist. I've merged those into other roles, which I'll explain when we get to them. My 10 are in combat, Striker, Tank, Controller, Buffer, Healer. And out of combat, Scout, Burglar, Face, Scholar, Utility Caster. Let's look at each. A Striker is a damage dealer who focuses on one or perhaps a couple of targets at a time, emphasizing doing a lot of damage. The Striker is the guy who kills your enemies. This is one half of the original fighter and one of the major roles in 4e. Anyone can be a Striker, though not everyone is great at it. Typically, this role is taken by fighters, barbarians, paladins, rangers, rogues, monks, and warlocks. But you don't want everyone doing it. Striker is one of the roles where it's okay to have more than one. They rarely interfere or step on each other's toes. While a 4-person party should have only one primary striker, a 5 or 6 character party could easily have 2 or 3. And you really want a secondary striker. That is, someone who is also better than average at causing damage, but might also have some other role in combat. Warlocks are particularly good as secondary strikers, firstly because their damage output is very good, but not in the same league as an optimized fighter. And they may wish to cast some control spells instead of just zapping their opponents. The tank, also known as a defender, is a big wall between the enemies and your squishier party members. His job is to stand there and take damage. It's all about high armor class and high hit points. In 4e, the defender role equally involves stickiness, the ability to keep the enemies around you, and while the better defenders do that in 5e with a feed or a fighter or paladin subclass feature, it's a nice add-on. It's not necessary. Partly this is due to it being assumed that enemies will stop to fight the guys in the front and not just run by, and partly because in 5e, even backliners are thought to have some defense. Fewer glass cannons and more porcelain cannons. Tank roles can be fun to play, as then you can always act like you're the savior of the other characters. It's not only okay to have more than one tank in the party, it's preferable. Your perfect 4-person party would have a primary tank and a backup or secondary one. A character with not quite as good an AC and hits, but still better than the squishy folks, who can stand next to or maybe a step behind the primary. However, you don't need too many tanks. If everyone is a tank, then no one is a tank. There's got to be some fragile folks that you're defending, or you aren't defending. Figure about half your party should be primary or secondary tanks. More than that is unnecessary. Less than that, and your backliners are in danger. Fighters, barbarians, and paladins normally take on this role, with clerics and artificers able to be the secondary. Subclasses open this role up to druids. Moon druids are exceptional tanks at low levels, and even wizards, and move some clerics and artificers into the primary role. Some lists of roles include the brute role, also known as the muscle, the one who breaks down doors and lifts heavy objects. but I found this role to be less important in 5e than in previous versions of D&D, and can usually be done without. But more importantly, for how I've laid this out, it matches with the normal tanks. So to the extent that this role still matters, it will normally be covered automatically by whoever's your tank. Right, the controller controls the battlefield. Who moves where, how quickly they move, what conditions they are in when they get there, and even if there is a battle at all. They use area effects to slow the enemy and walls to split up their forces. The controller is in charge of your team in battle, and you should follow his plan rather than some random one you made up. He may put the enemy to sleep. Don't wake him up. The controller is a role that only one person in the party should fill. Two controllers step on each other's toes and dim both their limelights. Figure, at 5th level, the most awesome thing you can do as a controller is halt the entire enemy squad with your hypnotic pattern. Great. Then what would controller number 2 do? Put a hypnotic pattern over yours? Or wake them all up with a different effect? No. You can have a secondary controller, one who does smaller effects, often in the service of the primary controller, such as a warlock who pushes targets back into an area of effect the primary controller has set up. But more than one primary is not only unnecessary, but can make the game less fun for several players. Now, blasting is often named as its own role, but I don't because it isn't absolutely necessary. A blaster causes damage to a large number of enemies. That's often called crowd control. Well, you can use a fireball to stop the horde, or you can use a hypnotic pattern. Both work. And in 5e, with minor exceptions, the same characters who use other forms of battlefield control are also the ones who cast blast spells. So I include blasting under controlling. Similarly, I placed debuffing under control. Partly this is because the line between the two is vague. If you slow one enemy, it's debuffing. But if 10, it's control. So what about 2? It helps that, again, the classes that are the best with control are also the best with debuffing, so to keep things simple, I combined them. Your standard controllers are wizards, sorcerers, bards, and druids. Now, the buffer is sometimes referred to as support, and in 4e was one half of the leader role. The buffer makes the other members of the party more able to fulfill their roles by granting them advantage on attacks or saves, and generally bolstering them when needed. You can have more than one buffer in a party, but only when they come from different classes or are built radically differently. After all, 2 characters casting Bless in a 4-person party is not useful. And as much as I love the cantrip Guidance, you only need one person in the party to have it. Top buffers are usually bards, clerics, and paladins. Having one of each in a 4 or 5-person party would work very well, but not 2 of any. Things have changed a lot over the years for the healer. The 5e healer is not like the healbots of old, and there are a lot more of them than there used to be. Healing in 5e is not about keeping the party at full hit points. It's about keeping each party member standing during a battle. Unless your DM is using the alternate damage rules, there's no difference between a character with 1 hit point left and one with 100, and you can't heal as quickly as they can inflict damage. So the healer only swoops in when a character falls, or when some condition is valved that needs to be removed. And if they can't manage that, then the healer can use a quick revivify to bring them right back again. Death is a rarity in this edition, and healing is a part-time job. Every healer will have some other role in combat, one that takes up a majority of the healer's time. It's okay to have more than one healer, though rapidly it becomes a waste, particularly for classes that have known spells instead of prepared ones. The best use of resources is to have one primary healer and one backup, who can aid a bit in supplying hit points, but mainly is around to cure the primary if he goes down. Clerics and druids are the traditional healers, and in 5e, bards and paladins can also do the job, although a bard who focuses on healing will be weaker as a controller and buffer. The known spell mechanic limits what he can do. Rangers and artificers make fine backup healers, while subclasses make monks and warlocks viable backup healers, and make sorcerers solid primaries. Although, like the bard, a primary healer sorcerer is not going to be up to par with other roles. Okay, then there's the scout, and he sneaks ahead of the party, finding the enemy, eavesdropping on meetings, and locating important objects. It's always been an awkward role in D&D, creating solo side quests for one character as everyone else yawns and waits. It might be more efficient to have that one character go off on their own, but not more fun? 5e solved this, though it never advertised the fact and most players don't seem to know it. In the old days, a rogue or ranger would use their move silently, hide, use rope, disable device, open lock, and search skills to scout. But this isn't your grandfather's D&D. Get with the times. It's 5e. Everything is done better with magic. Invisibility, silence, pass without trace, disguise self, fly, teleport, those all put the caster ahead of the skill user. And as levels increase, scrying and arcane eye make using skills seem archaic. But even those aren't the prime scouts and spies anymore. Those come with familiars and with wild shapes. Owls, cats, rats, bats, spiders, and invisible imps are the new technologies. 5e scouts send their pets to do the work, and they just peer through their eyes. This is not only safer and more effective, but works better in gameplay. No more solo adventures. The caster controls the familiar, but that doesn't lead to the same single character dominated hours that we got in the past. Now you really only need one scout. More are unnecessary, so if two people are planning on getting familiars in the party, they should work out beforehand why they are getting them. The best scouts now are usually wizards, druids, and warlocks. And arcane trickster rogues can regain this role. Note that there are several feats that give a character the Find Familiar spell, meaning any class can take on this role. The burglar is perhaps the simplest role in the game. Once confined to thieves, now anyone can do it. If you are proficient with thieves' tools, which can be gotten with a background, the role can be yours. You want proficiency and a high dex? Expertise and some way of buffing tool use is also good. As I mentioned, my rogues need int video. Dex is listed as the main attribute connected to thieves' tools, but it doesn't have to be the only one. A DM could instead choose intelligence. If you're undoing a trap where manipulating tiny cogs are the thing, then Dex is reasonable. But if you have to figure out if you're going to cut the red wire or the green wire, intelligence makes more sense. If undoing the trap requires bending a metal spring, then perhaps your thieves' tools role should be with strength. Or if the inner workings of the trap are submerged in icy water, perhaps con. However, Dex and Intelligence are the most common, so it's nice if your burglar hasn't dumped either stat. One burglar in the party is sufficient. A second could be useful as a backup. This role is easiest for rogues and artificers who get the thieves' tools as part of their class and have ways to buff their tool use. Bards are passable at it, and a Rune Knight fighter can easily be made to take on this role. Anyone else has to invest a bit more, but it is at least possible for any character. Now, the party face is the guy who gets things done with a smile and a wink and perhaps a command. He should do most of the talking when you meet strangers and can ease over many potential conflicts. It just requires a high charisma and some skills: persuasion, deception, and perhaps intimidation. Insight doesn't hurt. and the best faces have spells to back them up, such as Charm Person and Friends. A party only needs one face. If you fail to persuade the city guard that you're not the droids they're looking for, it's unlikely anyone else in the party is going to get a chance before they draw their weapons. And two face characters can get on each other's nerves and get in each other's way, and basically annoy the players. Now, bards are the kings of this role. Rogues, sorcerers, warlocks, and paladins also tend to fit it. This brings me to the scholar. The scholar fills in the party on important information and is based on intelligence and study, or in other words, knowing the intelligence-based skills. This role is tricky, and I can understand why someone might argue that it isn't a role at all, because no class is designed to fulfill the role, and is likely to be split up among several characters, to the extent that it is managed at all. But it should be managed, because these are some of the most important skills in the game: Arcana, Investigation, History, Nature, and Religion, and if split up, it's likely no one is going to do a good job in Scholarship. Not unless you are that rare party where lots of characters have high intelligences. Yeah, I don't see those. In the earliest editions of this game, this role was replaced by Game Master Exposition, but now instead of being told how things are, the scholar needs to figure them out. Thing is, D&D has never valued intelligence compared to other abilities. It's always been the weakest ability, and a majority of the classes are set up for the characters to dump intelligence. Only wizards and artificers clearly have high intelligences, and wizards are weak with skills and artificers are only so-so. I recommend rogues invest in intelligence, as they can afford it if they don't plan to be the party face. And with so many casters being charisma-based, chances are there's someone else who wants that role. The problem is rogues only have one intelligence skill on their list. Warlocks are the only ones with all of them, and they're unlikely to be able to invest in intelligence. Well, besides bards, who also prefer to dump intelligence. But a rogue who is willing to invest in this role through a background, a race, or a feat can excel here. And you do want someone to take on this role and do it well. It's a lot easier to win a fight when you know who and what you're fighting and what's going on. As mentioned, rogues, artificers, and wizards are the ones best suited for this role, though a bard can do it. For anyone else, it's tricky. And finally, utility casting, which I just call utility, except only casters manage it. The utility caster makes the party's life easier out of combat and stops the game from stalling. He finds things: objects, people, plants, animals. He senses magic and identifies it. He arranges communication both over distances and around languages. He keeps the party fed and transports them. But perhaps his most important job is securing a safe place to rest through alarms, watchdogs, extra-dimensional spaces, force domes, and pop-up castles. As this is such a broad area and requires a great deal of flexibility, most casters can't manage it. Druids and clerics can fulfill part of the role with clean water and food, but are missing too many essentials. Bards have a decent number of the needed spells, but the known spell mechanic cripples them. You need to be able to swap spells in and out, have a great number of spells available to you, more than most classes do, at a moment's notice, and be able to cast a great number of extra spells without it draining all of your resources. This limits us to ritual casters, and in particular, ones who can cast rituals without having to have the spell prepared. That means wizards and Pact of the Tome warlocks. Which oddly means that any good party would need one of those. Luckily, there's the ritual caster feat, which handles a lot of the heavy lifting. Have a bard or cleric or druid as well, and you're covered. In previous versions of Dungeons & Dragons, we had the survivalist role, which is pretty much the ranger guiding the other characters through the wilderness. But in 5e, there's really no difference between surviving in the wilderness versus the city versus the dungeon, and the utility caster covers them all. So that's my 10 roles, and what do we do with them? Well, as I mentioned before, to make the party more effective and to make it more fun for everyone, to give every player a moment, make your party such that it covers these roles and avoids some overlap of roles. That doesn't mean the perfect party is a fighter, cleric, wizard, and rogue, although it's amusing that after all this time, that 4-person party works and covers all the bases. Just figure that however you put it together, you keep the roles covered. So if you replace the wizard with a bard, great, then someone should take the ritual caster feat to make up for that now empty role. Pull out the cleric? Fine. The bard could switch to more healing, but if not, a replacement should include healing. So how about a paladin? Drop the rogue? Well, Face was already covered by the bard, but we need a character to take on the burglar role, perhaps with a background. And I'd want someone to be covering the scholar role, so the skilled feat and skilled expert feat might be needed. See, there's no perfect party. There's many ways to build a party that's excellent, and it doesn't need optimized characters. It just needs all the roles covered. So, talking about roles is useful just to clarify what most of you already know. We need a healer and somebody who does damage, etc. But of course, I have another motivation. See, I've been wanting to rank the base classes, and it doesn't make sense to just rank them by who can beat up who, which would radically change by level anyway. But this is my foundation for evaluating the classes. How many roles does a class fulfill? And more importantly, how good is it at those roles? And that's for next time. Hopefully you'll join me. And based on how YouTube works, and that rankings draw more of an audience, I'm guessing more of you will join me for that than this anyway. That's it for now. Relax, enjoy, and remember, if someone says you're drunk, it's a compliment.